Hi, everybody. Today's topic is building custom directives for AngularJS. This is a topic that I like to talk about because when I started with Angular, of course, I found building applications very attractive because of the data binding and the testability. But as I dug into Angular a little bit further, I found that a lot of things that I wanted to do revolved around custom directives or building my own directives. And as I looked through the Angular source code, I began to realize that most of Angular, all the JavaScript that is inside of Angular.js, is about providing the infrastructure for directives and the directives themselves, all the directives that we use like ngClick, ngForm, ngModel, and so forth. And today, I really have two different perspectives on directives. On the left-hand side is the pretty landscape. On the right-hand side is the machinery. So on the left-hand side of the screen, that's mostly what I'm going to focus on today, which is building custom directives to enhance your HTML, to make your markup more in line with the user interface that you're trying to build and the user experience that you're trying to create. So building custom directives to form a vocabulary for the widgets and the things that you think about in your specific user interface. I'll also, if there's time, touch a little bit on the right-hand side of the screen, which is directives are the machinery that make Angular work. It's all that equipment in the basement of the building that no one wants to be around because it's kind of noisy and it's greasy. But it's that machinery and things like ngClick and ngModel that really make Angular work on a day-to-day basis. So the left-hand side, the pretty landscape, this is basically a talk about getting away from the primitive obsession of HTML. You might have heard of the term primitive obsession. It's a code smell that we talk about when we're looking through code and we see someone is using built-in primitive types to represent important business concepts like a monetary value. In a language like C#, I can certainly use a decimal type and a string type to represent some amount and some currency type, but using primitives like that always comes back to be a problem in the end because there's a lack of encapsulation there. And HTML provides a lot of primitives, but since HTML is a specification designed for anyone to build web pages and web applications, what we end up doing is creating lots of divs with certain classes to adjust certain pieces to look a certain way, and scanning through a lot of HTML to find the really important things that need to jump out to you is kind of difficult. The solution to this that is coming in the future is there is a specification for custom elements so that we will be able to write custom elements that the browser knows about, and we can plug them in. And if we have something like an accordion, we don't have to say div class equals accordion anymore. We can just say accordion as the HTML element. That's a future specification, but there's already some libraries that are trying to make that specification and the feel of how to write custom elements available today. One example is Polymer. Another example is Xtags. But then Angular can do this too. Its tagline is HTML enhanced for web apps. The idea being that you can create custom elements and you can create a better HTML, almost a domain-specific language for your application. As an example, let's assume that we're using Bootstrap.js. One of the features that Bootstrap provides is a number of alert classes. So I can create a div with a class of alert, alert-warning, alert-dismissible. And each of those classes that I add to that markup influences how that div appears. The alert class applies certain typographical styles, provides some specific border and padding, while alert-warning applies a certain color, and alert-dismissible allows JavaScript to hook in so that if someone clicks on a close button, the alert will go away. But it would be nice if I could just write alert type equals warning and get rid of some of this extraneous class names. And if I always want a button there so a user can close the alert, that would be nice too. So this is all about creating a better HTML. It's about creating that pretty landscape so that when I look at a page, I can instantly recognize pieces of my application. So this is what we're actually going to build, our own custom alert. And let me bring up code editor and a browser and talk about the current situation that we have. This is the Bootstrap alert that's appearing here in the top of the browser. And then I have an alert that I want to create a custom Angular directive so that this markup looks and behaves just the same as the previous markup. Currently, that's not happening. And before I go down this path, I do just want to point out one thing. This behavior has already been implemented. There's a project out there, UI Bootstrap, that provides native Angular wrappers for all of the Bootstrap components. This means you can use things like alert and accordion and carousel without writing any code or including jQuery or including bootstrap.js. So that would be something else that I want to do. Currently, this Bootstrap alert is dismissible, but that's only because I have jQuery and Bootstrap included. I'd like to be able to get rid of those. And now, let's try to implement a custom alert. So I already have an ng app directive in this file, and I should have mentioned this at the beginning. I do assume that you've done a little bit of Angular and you understand ng app and ng controller, but maybe just haven't written a custom directive. I have an ng app, and I have that module directive defined. Now what I need to do is add a directive named alert and provide a callback function for Angular so that it knows about alert and what the alert characteristics are. So this callback I'm providing is only executed once. It defines the alert. In fact, what I have to return from here is an object that we call the directive definition object. The name is significant because this name will have to match up with what I'm using in my HTML, and more on that in just a second. Inside of a directive definition object, a couple of things that I can do include restricting this alert to only appear in certain places, and that's just done with like a single character in mnemonic. So E is for element, A is for attribute. I can also provide a template, something like this, just to test and get started with this. Let me save everything and see if that works, and it does. So Angular detected my directive definition object. It replaced or added my template into the DOM at the place where I had my alert. Let's just try a couple things here. I'll make a copy of this alert and also have an alert that is a div. And let's just write div with an attribute of alert. So will this work too? Yes, that works too, but only because I said that it's legal as an attribute. So if I save this file and we're only using elements, Angular won't insert my template, whereas using an attribute. So commonly people will choose elements and attributes. Something else you might like is C, which stands for class. Now, any place where that says class equals alert will also be detected as that directive, and Angular will insert the template. So now I've replaced even my previous div class that just had a class, or a div element that had a class equals to alert. So class can be very useful when you're using an existing CSS framework and you just want to add in some functionality to DOM elements that have a class name on them. The last one is M, which is an HTML comment, which nearly nobody uses. For this demo, I'm just going to stick with E and A. That's what we want. And of course, most HTML becomes a little bit too complicated to put into a string, and that's why Angular also allows you to specify a template URL, which I already have this file created, alert.html. I just need to populate it with some information. So inside of alert.html, let me get rid of some existing code here so we can build it up from scratch. Save this file, and we're now using a template URL. So let me flip back to the slides for just a second and talk about just a couple things that we've seen. One is the directive definition object. That's the E, A, C, and M that I described. Typically want to restrict to something like E or A. And then the template that I'm using, alert.html, Instead of specifying an inline template like the code there on the screen, I want to move my HTML markup into an HTML file. Now one concern that people have is when an Angular application starts up and you're using 5 or 10 or 15 custom directives with all these little template files, the browser has to go off and fetch those individual HTML fragments using an asynchronous request and XHR request, and that's true. If that's something that you're worried about, the performance aspect of that, there is a quite handy Node.js tool out there that works with Grunt, the task runner for JavaScript. It's Grunt Angular templates. Excuse me. You can essentially point that tool at a folder or folders full of templates. It will compile them into JS files that you can load into a page. And those templates will automatically be put in a cache that Angular calls the template cache. So they're just available right from the start. You don't have to go out and make all these little requests to grab your templates. All right, back to Visual Studio. Let's try first to make our alert appear like the Bootstrap alert. And I will remove the second alert for right now, just so we don't get too confused. The first problem I have is that I don't really want to display, hard-coded text for my template. I would like to give the person who's using my directive the ability to specify some custom template to go into this alert. And they might want to change this to be anything. So how do I get that content that is inside of index.html, how do I use that from a template? That's a process that Angular calls transclusion. What I can do is set a transclude flag on my directive definition object to say this is going to be doing transclusion. And then inside of alert, there's a directive that I can use, ngTransclude, which is a fancy way of saying take any content from inside of the DOM element, inside of this document, and just move it into the position where I have my ngTransclude so that if I save everything here, I've now successfully allowed someone to use my custom directive and specify any sort of text that they want here. The next piece to look at would be trying to get my headphones out of the way so I don't collide with the keyboard as much. There we go. The next step would be trying to get this styled like the alert. So there's an easy way to do this and there's a hard way to do this. I'm going to start by showing you the hard way just because it shows you a little bit about how directives can work at a lower level if you need that type of flexibility. So what I'll do is provide a function known as the link function. This link function gets some specific parameters that are passed to it by Angular. It's going to take a scope object, which we'll be talking about quite a bit. It's going to take the element that is pointing to the root of my template. It's going to take attributes, which is an easy way to get to any attributes that were specified on the directive. So if I say alert type equals warning, warning should be a property on attributes. And that's all we actually need for now. So if I wanted to find the type that a user specified, so if they said type equals warning, I should be able to walk up to attributes and say, give me the type. And I could provide a default, let's say, if they didn't specify type. Well, let's just try attributes.type. And then element is Angular's wrapper around the DOM element that represents the markup that you're using from your template. It implements the jQuery Lite API, which is like the 80% of the jQuery API that you use most often. Things like the ability to add a class, to hook up an event with on, the ability to search through children for a specific element. And so what I want to do is I'm going to assume that anything that's built with this alert directive will need the class of alert, and then I just need to add in that additional directive to color the alert, something like alert-info or alert-danger. And I could do that if I said element, let's add a class called alert dash and add in the type that we retrieved from attributes, that will start to color my alert list just a little bit. But you notice it's still not quite the same as the top. The reason for that is if we come in and inspect elements, my developer tools were on a different screen here. You can see the way Angular built out this custom directive was, there was my original markup saying alert type equals warning, and then here my template gets inserted into that alert as a child element. So one class goes on this div and one class is on the outside on the alert. What I would like to do instead is tell Angular just to replace that DOM element. And now I have something that's a little more bootstrapping. I should also have a close button on here. So let me copy this markup for a button into my template. And I won't need data-dismiss. All I really need is the button with the X inside of it. And now from inside of my scope or inside of my linking function, something else that I can do is I can go to element and I can ask for children of a specific type. Now, one thing to keep in mind with this children API is in jQuery, if I ask for children, I can provide all sorts of selectors there to say, give me children that have a specific class or the specific attribute. With the JQLite API that Angular provides by default, you can really only search for children by tag type. So I'm looking for that one button inside of my template. And by the way, if you include jQuery before you include Angular.js, you'll have the full jQuery API available. But now let's do a button.on. What I want to do is when there is a click on that close button, one thing I could do is just say element.removed to remove that DOM element. So let's try this. If I save everything and I have my alert directive, it's not quite formatted properly, but I can now click on that button to get rid of it. So there's some definite problems with this linking function, and this actually isn't the way that I would suggest you write this. We're going to rewrite this in just a second. But it does demonstrate some of the capabilities that you can have inside of a linking function. You have access to the elements, the attributes. You also have access to the scope. In fact, one other approach that I could take to this is to say scope.close. I'm going to add a function to my scope. Is something that will do an element.remove. And what would happen if I did something like this? Well, that, if I save everything, should still work. But here's one indication that there might be a problem. Let me take this alert and make a few copies of it. And we'll change this to a 1, 2, just so we can see which one is which. Save everything. Now I have 3 alerts. So I'm going to click on the second alert to try to get it to close. And when I click on that second alert, the third alert disappears. That would be the first indication that there's a serious problem with the way I implemented this. And now if I keep trying to click on these close buttons, they're just not going anywhere. Let's try to fix that. But before I do, you're probably wondering, well, what's actually happening behind the scenes? Maybe I could make it a little more obvious if I added a little something extra inside of here. And let me move this button to the top. Hopefully that looks a little better now. That's better. And let's add a label where a user would have to type in a reason that this alert appeared, or why did this happen, basically. So an input type equals text. We will use an ng model directive because I can use Angular directives. I can use any directives inside of my directive template. Ng model equals reason. So we'll be trying to bind that to a reason, and I'll give it a name. And so now my directive appears. There's a input where I can enter a reason, and that's a bit of a problem. And I just realized if I click anywhere on the element, it's closing. I'll try to debug that later. But This kind of shows what's happening. When I create a directive, by default, the scope of that directive will be the same as the parent scope. So when I create this function on the scope object and say scope.close is a function where we do element.remove, and that forms a closure around element, well, this would happen, this linking function, by the way, it executes once for each instance of the directive on the page. So the first time it executes for directive number 1, it's going to close around that element. And the second time, the second element, and the third time, the third element. It's all the same close function, but it just turns out that that close function, the last version of it that I add to scope is going to be one that closes around the third element. And that's why that third item always disappears. And we know now that the scope is shared because ngModel, when it's pushing this value from the input back into the scope, it's pushing it into a scope that's shared between these two directives. And it is the same as the parent scope. What is the parent scope? Let's take a look at index.html. Currently I have these alerts, and I have an ng app, and I don't have an ng controller, so the scope would be root scope. To open up some interesting scenarios here, let's create an ng controller. We'll call it the alerts controller. I want to have a scope there that I can play with. So over in the app, we can do an app.controller, alerts controller. That will be a function that takes a scope object. And inside of here, we'll be able to play with some things. But let's start trying to fix this up so things function a little more correctly. Let me save everything, make sure we're still in a working state, which we are, and come back to the slides for just a moment. We talked about transclusion, just trying to make sure that I don't lose my place here. That's the ability to move content from the view into my template. Very simple ng transclude directive to do that. We're looking at the linking function and the way to think about it is we're linking the DOM to a specific Angular scope. So when we add things to scope or we wire up events and hook them up to methods that would be called on the scope, that's linking the two together, the scope and the DOM. Inside of the link, it's safe to modify things. You can inject just additional elements if you need a very dynamic display. But the problem we have right now that we want to solve, jumping back into the code, is the fact that all of these are sharing the same scope. So one way to get rid of that is inside of my directive definition object to include a scope property, and I'll initially just set this to a new empty object and save this file. And now you can see that when I type inside of here, if I could type inside of there, all of a sudden the close is starting to work correctly. So this is what we call an isolated scope in Angular. It's a way of having each instance of this directive get its own unique scope object to work with. That scope object, unlike other scopes that we use from controllers like the alert controller that we have out here, does not inherit from its parent. This isolated scope will always inherit from root scope, so it's a bit offset from the typical prototypal inheritance chain that is set up for scopes. But now the question becomes, if I do need the reason that the user is typing in, how do I get that reason into my alerts controller? So let's set up this scenario. I'll start this off very simple. This isn't the code that I would want to write for production, but we will modify that. Let's say that alerts controller has a reason 1 property and a reason 2 property, which is, we'll just set that one to empty. And what I want to do is when I use these custom directives, those 2 directives in my page, right now I have 3, but I'll cut it down to 2. What I want to be able to do is hook up reason 1 to the first directive and reason 2 to the second directive. So in index.html, after I save this file, let's get rid of one of these directives. Ultimately, what I want to be able to do is say reason equals reason 1 and have that be an expression that effectively attaches to that reason one on my scope object in the controller. And this one will be reason two. The way I can do that, the easy way to do that from app.js is inside of my directive definition object, there is a syntax that you can use, a shortcut syntax, to effectively say there's a property that I want on this scope that I want down to an expression that will be provided when someone is writing this directive in the page. And that shortcut expression will look something like this. This is saying that my scope on this directive will have a reason property, and I want it to be bound in both directions with whatever attribute is specified, whatever expression is specified by something named reason on the directive. So reason inside of the scope for this directive should effectively bind against reason one from the scope of alerts controller. And if I change reason one from alerts controller, that change should be pushed into that directive instance. And if I change that reason from the directive instance, it should be pushed back the other way, back into my alerts controller. Let me save all this, and you can see that reason one appears here as none. So I have that binding. And if I come into index.html, let's just have a little expression here that will write out reason one. So I can see it's being pushed from the controller into my directive scope. And now I'm going to have to fix up my close function. Well, for now, I'm just going to delete it because we're going to replace that functionality in a bit anyway. Get rid of that so these things don't close when I click on them. Now, if I change this, it gets pushed back into my alerts controller also. That's one type of binding. Another type of binding that I could have is I could say type. I want that to be an attribute binding, which is very similar to what equals does, because now I will have a property on this scope object called type. I won't have to go to the attributes anymore, and it will be bound to the string that is specified here. So if I say type equals danger and save this, I'll be able to get to the string value danger automatically just by looking at on my scope and looking at type, which means I don't really need to add a class inside of my linking function. Now what I could do to make this a little bit simpler is to come into my template and just say class equals alert and also alert dash type, and that will be the type on my isolated scope for this directive. So that works. And I should be able to come into index.html just to make sure this is working. And one is danger and one is info. Well, oh, yeah, I have two types on here. So that would be one reason. So I want one to be danger, one to be warning. That looks better. So that string value is getting pushed into my directive automatically. And then the final thing I would want to do is get the close button working again. And usually this is something that, well, in this case, this is something that the directive might not know how to handle. What should happen when someone closes a directive? Well, I don't know. I could just remove the DOM element. The chances are the controller, my outside controller, might want to know when someone has closed a directive because it needs to save something to the server or modify a data structure. So another form of binding is with ampersand, and this effectively will bind to an expression that is invoked. In other words, if inside of my template now, when someone clicks on this button, if I just say ng close equals close, that is, in a sense, saying what I want to do is invoke the close function that was specified on the directive. So out in index.html, let me create something hard-coded for just a moment. I could say close equals close reason one. And this can be a function then. Whoops. on my controller scope back here, scope dot, copy the wrong thing. I think it was called close reason one, it's a function. Maybe what I would do here is have a flag, show alert one, said it's true, and this would really be close alert one. And I could say scope dot show alert one is false, and it picks up some things now inside of the alert or in the index.html, close alert one. Let's see if this has a chance of working. Save everything, and now I want to click on this to close it. Oh, I could say ng, only ng show this if show alert one is positive. Because now I thought what we were doing is toggling that flag, show alert one. And I'm invoking it there. If everything's saved. I think I might have missed something there. Well, let's try something else, more interesting. What should happen, let me look at this one more time. I'm saying close should bind to the function expression that's provided in the attribute. I do have an ng close, ng click event should invoke that, which is now what's happening. So I can close these. All right, I can only close the first one because that's the only place that I put that ng show. But let's come up with a more realistic example. Let me go into my controller, and instead of doing all this crazy stuff with reason one and reason two, let's just say I have a collection of alerts to show the user. So I'll have an array. And this will be an array of alert objects. Every alert object will have some sort of message like, this is dangerous. It'll have a type, which would be danger. It will have a reason. We could default this one to none. And now let me just make a couple copies of this and change some of the text around. I can have a warning. I can have an info. We'll blank this one out. Just put in some silly text here. This is a warning. This is some info. All right, so what I want to do is have the alerts controller. The alerts controller wants to display each one of these objects inside of an alert and give the ability to close. And when the user closes a specific alert, I want to remove the alert from this array. So inside of my markup, instead of having all the crazy stuff here, let's create a div that will ng repeat alert and alerts. Inside of here, I can have alert type equals alert.type. Reason equals alert.reason. That's going to be a problem, but I'll show you, alert.reason is going to work. Alert.type is going to be a problem. I'll show you why in just a second. And inside of here, I actually want a data binding against alert.message. Let's see if this works. Very good. So I'm displaying the reason for the 3 alerts. That seems to work. I'm displaying the message for each alert. That seems to work. The one piece that is not working is alert.type. And this is where you can see a significant difference between the equals binding and the ampersand binding, the scope binding and the attribute binding. The attribute binding assumes there's just going to be a string value in the attribute, so it reads it out directly. In other words, when I say type ampersand, what I'm looking for is type, and then just treat this as a string. Don't try to evaluate it as an expression. Just take that string and literally lift it out of the DOM and put it into that property. So if I were to do an element inspection, I would see that there's a div inside of here that says class equals alert space alert dot type, which is not what I want. In order for that to work, I really need to interpolate or have alert.type evaluated as an expression and then put into the attribute, and I can do that with the double curly braces in Angular. So I can save that, and that's now working. So I should have 3 different alert types there. And hopefully that makes some sense. I know that was very confusing for me when I started with Angular. Why sometimes do I have an attribute here that just says alert.reason, and sometimes I need to use the double curlies? Well, I need to use the double curlies if I want to have an expression put something into that attribute value that is bound with an ampersand, because that's just looking for the straight up string value of that attribute, whereas the equals binding, the scope binding, is going to walk up to this attribute value and assume it is an expression that has to be evaluated against the scope in order to get that value. So that part works. And now the last part would be what happens when I close this. Well, let's have a close function that says close alerts, and I'll need to pass in the index of the alert that was clicked on. So $index is just a magic variable that you get when you're inside an ng repeat. If there's 3 alerts, it will go 0, 1, and 2. So inside of my controller, I should be able to provide scope.close alert. You give me an index, sorry, that is a function, or you give me an index, and what I could do is scope.alerts, maybe we could splice out at that index 1 element. Let's see if this works. That works. And that is the essential pieces of what I wanted to explain about custom directives, just the ability to write a little bit of code, and actually most of it is just declarative code. I don't even need this link function anymore. Just a little bit of declarative code where now inside of my HTML, I have the ability to just write alerts, do all sorts of data bindings against things like the reason, and it's a lot clearer markup, I think, and has some default behaviors than trying to specify everything at a slightly lower level using Bootstrap like this. So a little bit of time left just to run through some slides and review what we just did. So first of all, isolated scope. By default, when I create a directive, it's going to share the same scope as its parent, but an isolated scope, when I just say scope : and provide an object of some sort, that's going to isolate this directive scope from everything else. It will inherit from root scope, but anything you put in that scope is not going to interfere with the controller scope. But then when you have an isolated scope, you typically want to bind properties of that scope to the outside environment against attributes, against things that might be in a parent controller somewhere. And that's where you have @ to bind attribute values as strings, equals to bind a model value from another scope, and ampersand that will effectively bind a function. So if you invoke that property, you'll be invoking the function in someone else's scope somewhere. Those 3 bindings then form a bridge, or can form a bridge between your controller scope and your isolated directive scope. Just remember that equals is binding model values, so I want to bind something from my scope to the isolated scope. Ampersand is binding attributes. It's always going to look, if I say, please give me a scope with the type ampersand, it's always going to look at that type attribute on the directive and take that literal string as a value and put it into my scope. So that's quite commonly used when you just expect people to, you want a property on your scope to represent that attribute value, and it's typically not something that someone will want bound against their controller scope. They're just going to specify something as a string. And then there's ampersand to bind to a function. So if I specify on my scope object that I want a close down to ampersand, it will look for an attribute of the same name on my directive close and invoke that expression for me. So just a little bit of plumbing in the time that we have left. I just wanted to make you aware of some other capabilities of custom directives. First of all, you can create a controller for your directive. So I could register a controller like the alert controller, and it could take responsibility for handling certain events if there's a lot of complicated logic or processing that happens that needs to happen. I'll give you an example of this in just a minute from the Angular source code. Because quite often, one reason that you want to write a controller is that you want to communicate with other controllers, maybe Angular controllers or your own controllers. And this happens quite often when you're inside a form. So if you think about how a form works, typically the different inputs that you have inside of a form with the ng model directives and the form tag itself, they all have to be orchestrated together to understand when things are valid, when things are invalid, what the model values are, how you push values back and forth. What you see on the screen is a little directive from the Angular documentation that I've tweaked a little bit that allows me to put the attribute content editable on an HTML element, and then I can use ng model to bind against that content editable DOM element. I can push whatever the user types into that DOM element into my scope. And in order to do that, I have to work a little bit with the ng model controller itself. Let me actually show you something from the Angular source code, which I think is interesting, that might demonstrate this a little better. Let me do a search for ng model directive. And if we find this function here, this is the directive definition object for ng model. So when I say ng model equals reason, this is the directive definition object that Angular uses to determine how that's going to behave. A couple different things inside of here that we haven't seen before. First, notice the require. Require is a way to tell Angular that this particular directive requires other controllers to be in place. The ng model directive requires the ng model controller. That's not going to be a problem. It also optionally, because of this character, requires a form controller that is a parent. That's what that character signifies. So I might optionally have a form controller that I want to interact with. This array will represent the parameters that you get as the fourth parameter to your link function. So if I ask for an ng model controller and optionally a form controller, those will be array sub 0 and array sub 1 on this controls variable. So model controller sub 0, form controller is sub 1, but it's optional, so you can see there's a default here of some null form controller. So inside of a directive, once you have a reference to another controller, you can walk up to that controller and interact with it. So one of the things an ng model directive will do is walk up to the form controller that is its parent, if it's there, and effectively register itself and say, hey, there's a little bit of data binding going on down here. So when you're checking to make sure things are valid, or if someone tells you to set everything into a pristine state, make sure you tell me about that, because I'm one of the controls that is inside of this form, and I need to provide feedback and user feedback and add the right classes for when things are pristine and when things are valid and invalid and so forth. The ng model controller, to take a quick look at that, go to the definition. Effectively, from a controller, if you can expose an API by adding attributes to the controller itself. So by saying this.parsers and this.formatters, other controllers that need the ng model controller can inspect parsers and inspect formatters and inspect if something is dirty or valid or set those properties. And these are basically the APIs that these two controllers provide, ng form controller and ng model controller. You'll notice ng form controller, you can add controls, you can set validity, you can set the entire form into a pristine state that will add the different CSS classes, so it might render a bit differently. ng model controller has an API to allow you to do things like set a view value or set validity. This model is currently invalid, so I'm going to set the validity so that the proper CSS classes appear to let the user know that this is invalid. Finally, there is a compile function that is inside of the directive. And there's always a lot of questions about compile versus link, and here's the big difference. The compile function will execute once if I'm using a directive. The compile function will execute once for every time the directive appears in my markup. In other words, when I have an alert here that is inside of a div, the compile will execute once for this alert. And inside of the compile function, you'll notice I still have access to things like scope and element and attributes. I don't have access to scope yet. I have access to element and attributes. This is a place where I can do some DOM manipulation if I wanted to against the element. I can do it once in the compile function. And then for each instance of this directive, the link function will execute, and that's where you can include the scope and start setting up bindings against the scope. So the idea is that when you're inside of an ng repeat, if you have a directive that has to do a lot of DOM manipulation, if you can do that DOM manipulation in compile before you receive a scope, then that effectively forms a template element that is then stamped out for each link function, and the link function runs against each instance. So in this scenario, if I had 3 alerts, I would have compile execute once, and then I would have link execute 3 times, once for each actual instance of the directive. And I think we're just about at time for questions, so I'm going to slowly flip through these slides, and you can remember some of the text on here, some things that you might want to do, like you can do a scope.watch from a directive. It's quite often useful if you want to be able to know when something changes at the exact moment. At this point, I'll try to go through some of the questions. I think we only have about 13. So the restrict constraint. Someone has asked about the restrict constraint. The restrict constraint is effectively telling Angular where it can look for something called, where should it look for something named alert and treat it as a directive. So if I say A is short for attribute, that's telling Angular only look for this directive when it appears as an attribute on an element. And in that case, I lose all of my alerts here because I'm using this directive as an element. So A is short for attribute, E is short for element, C is short for class. If someone has class equals alert, that would do that. Oh, what am I using to show HTML without refreshing the browser? I'm actually using Grunt, which is a node tool. There are some capabilities inside of Visual Studio that set up a link between the browser and Visual Studio so that when you save a file, it will automatically refresh the browser. But it doesn't work under all conditions. And so in this project, I just have a very simple Grunt file that uses something called grunt contrib watch. So, and Grunt runs under node. And basically, it's watching the file system for changes to JS files or HTML files. And when that happens, it will tell Chrome to reload because I have a little live reload extension installed into Chrome that knows how to listen to the live reload endpoint that's set up by Grunt contrib watch. So if you go to the Chrome store and do a search for live reload, you can download that extension, and it's also available for other browsers. Someone asked how well Angular supports IE8, and the problem there is that as of Angular 1.3, I believe, they're not testing IE8 support any longer. So it might work in IE8, but there also might be some problems. And if you go to the Angular documentation, even if you're using Angular 1.2, you want to be aware of some situations where you might have to take extra care. For example, custom elements like this in some versions of Internet Explorer, I know, have some problems. You need to take a couple of additional steps, and I believe do a document.create element before you ever use this directive if you want it to work properly in Internet Explorer. Someone asked a question about controller as functionality. So if someone doesn't want to use scope, they want to use the controller as syntax. That's actually just not a syntax that I use that often, but the directive itself wouldn't change. You can set up a controller directive and have it contain the properties that you want, but to be honest, I haven't tried controller as with a custom directive, so I'm not sure I could answer that question. Brian wants to know if you can use in a same approach, which I don't remember what approach we were at, to call a JS function that is not part of the scope. I mean, you could always, I think that might be a question like this. If I do have a link function, it takes a scope and an element and attributes and so forth. Is there a way for me to, let's say, hook up something to an element so that when it calls click, I don't have to have an anonymous function inside of here? And the answer is, yeah, certainly. I mean, you could have helper functions defined inside of this anonymous function that defines the alert. So I could have some sort of private helper function here. Maybe I need to pass it some parameters, but I could always say, helper and get that function invoked if you don't like the anonymous function. Trying to scan through some questions here to answer. All the elements created with the alert directive will have their own scope. That's only true when you do this isolated scope syntax. So without that, every alert would have the same scope as its parent, no matter how many times it appears on the page. But as soon as you add a scope definition inside of the directive definition object, then every single instance of that directive will have its own isolated scope. Another good question, is there a reason why we would not always want to use restrict E for a directive like alert? And let's see. Yeah, so you might want to restrict that to be only used as an element. It really all depends on how flexible you want the directives to be and what you want to allow developers to do. So if I'm developing a custom directive for a team, I probably have a very specific idea about how I want them to use that directive, or I have some ideas about what we want our markup to look like for that project. So I might say, let's enforce this to be an element all the time. But if I'm writing something that might be shared amongst other projects, or it's an open source project where I don't know what people might want to do with it, I would consider at least adding E, A, and C just in case people want all those options, because, or at least E and A, some people don't like to see custom HTML elements. They might always want to use an attribute to create a directive in the markup. How do Angular's directives compare to Ember components? I'm not sure. I've only done a little bit with Ember, and I haven't done any performance comparisons. When is it better to use a compile pre-link, post-link controller? Definitely you want to use the compile function if you have the ability, can't type now, to make modifications to the DOM element before it gets stamped out for each directive instance. It's a little bit of a performance benefit. So if you have a situation like this where you're using alert inside of an ng repeat, if I had to go in and manipulate the element before it starts getting repeated upon, the compile function would be a good place to do that. Pre-linking and post-linking, those are functions that get returned from the compile function. Basically, you'll want to start using those if you have a directive where you need to initialize things or set up an environment as a hierarchy of directives is being initialized. Because pre-linking allows you to access some code when your parents are set up but your children are not set up as yet, and post-linking allows you to execute some code after your children have been set up. So hopefully that's some insight into that. I've always looked at the Angular source code for some of these examples, and ng model directive and ng form directive are some good examples that go into compile and pre-linking and post-linking. Someone wants to know that if we use an isolated scope, how can we still inherit some properties from the parent scope? And there really will be no inheritance relationship if you set up an isolated scope. The only way to get things from some other scope, like a controller scope, into this scope is to use some sort of binding like this. That's the most effective and easy way. If you wanted to do it imperatively, you could always have a link function that goes out and looks for things and sets up watches and so forth. But the declarative approach is pretty easy, and you can still get any values that you need inside of the scope with this approach. Do you think directives impact on performance? There is some performance impact, but in the Angular applications I've worked on, It's really the data binding expressions and the amount of data that has to get pushed on the screen that has more of a performance hit, at least for the types of applications that I've been building. So, building a custom directive that appears 1,000 times on a page is probably going to be a little bit slow, not because there's 1,000 instances of that directive, but because there can be 1,000 watches set up for data binding expressions that are inside the template, something like that. Looks like a couple questions on nested directives. I actually did have an example. Well, I guess it's not necessarily nested directives, but something we didn't get into today. If I think I understand the question. Yes, would be an example where I might have an alert directive and there's some relationship between this alert directive and an alert header directive that expects to be inside of an alert directive. And quite often when you have a relationship like this, you want things like the alert header might have to communicate with the alert controller or vice versa. That's those types of situations where you might want to require some other directive to be in place. So here with the alert header, what I'm saying is the only way for alert header to work is that there has to be an alert directive as a parent. And of course, the alert directive itself, that array allows me to get access to those two controllers. And then when someone clicks on something, I can let a parent controller know, tell it to do something interesting. A couple questions about transclude, I think. Record this for how am I using ng transclude? Just to review that real quick, if I find the right place. I can say that my directive is going to do some transclusion. And when I do that, so the whole idea of transclusion is I want the ability to take some content that someone is placing inside of my directive, like this alert.message binding. I want the ability to take that and lift it out of this area of the markup and actually get it into my template. And I can do that. Let me close some files here with ng transclude. And so this is where I would want that content to appear. I could cut that out and put it down here, to position that transcluded content into different places. But where's this is dangerous coming from? It's coming from content that's inside of that directive. And if you need something more flexible, there actually is an option with the linking function. The linking function will take the scope, the element, the attributes, the controllers, and then a fifth parameter you can actually ask for is a transclusion function, which if you invoke it, will give you back information about what's inside the directive, and you can piece things together in a more manual process. And I think there's a couple more questions. What is the M for in restrict? M is for HTML comment. And to be honest, I've never used this. I think that flexibility is there just for some extreme circumstances, perhaps. And I think I even read where it's going to be deprecated or not available in the future. So M would be looking for something in the HTML like alert, an alert directive inside of an HTML comment. Well, there's more questions that I can answer, and I notice it is 1 o'clock. I'll keep a record of all these questions, and if you do have a burning question or notice something that you need more information about, feel free to email me. I do reply to all emails. It might take a while if there's a lot of questions, but I promise to get to them. Otherwise, thanks everyone for showing up.